I would think that the majority of interactions that law enforcement has with different individuals in society is a really bad day for that person. But that's every day for law enforcement, and so that has to drag on them.
The amount of highly traumatizing and extreme life events a police officer experiences just in their working life is about, it's a very big range now, but it's about 300 or 600 times the amount of that the normal person goes through. So it's immense, even without all the added stress of everything that's been going on in the media and the very one-sided representation of what was going on, especially in America. And it's interesting what you say about the people that police encounter having a bad day. So another person I met through LinkedIn, who is also a speaker, whom I'm also working on a course on, he's done a lot of training of professionals in the past, and we're developing a course together. He was saying that police officers actually have really bad relationships because the majority of people they encounter are probably having one of the worst days of their life.
Susanne, welcome to All Things Crime.
Thank you very much, Jared.
For those of you that are either listening or watching this All Things Crime episode, I need to introduce Susanne, and I apologize if I butcher this, Susanne Knabe-Nicol.
Yes, that's fine.
Oh, that's good. I made it. So she is, and I'm really excited about having you on. So I appreciate it, especially with all the time difference. You're in the UK, and being on the western side of the United States, we're almost directly on the opposite side of the world. So, but Susanne is a doctor over Police Science Doctor, which is a new website, and it's designed to help law enforcement boil down to just the basics of different things, different policies, different ways to communicate. A much different type of episode. I'm going to definitely let her explain this, but she does conferences, videos, podcasts, and to me, it sounds like you are offering just a fabulous resource, really, for law enforcement. So if you could just take a few minutes and introduce yourself, maybe talk a little bit about how you got into doing what you're doing now, and then really lay out what it is you're doing for law enforcement.
Yes, so Susanne Knabe-Nicol, as you said, I'm an investigative psychologist. I studied part-time whilst I was working for the police. I've got over 10 years experience of working in a variety of roles in UK policing. So for a short while, I was in uniform as a police community support officer in London. And then for the longest time afterwards, I was doing intelligence research. I was an investigator in the custody unit, investigating suspects, putting case files together. And then I worked in a more of an evidence-based policing role before I left. Whilst I was studying, I had done my master's in investigative psychology, and I was now doing my part-time PhD. And I was fascinated by all the amazing research that I was reading on, the best ways of interviewing suspects, the best ways of getting proper memory recall from witnesses and interviews. And I was then baffled to see that nobody was actually giving that information to the people who are doing the interviews. So we've got pretty good training. I mean, the UK is sort of known for being pretty advanced when it comes to a few things that are related to policing, like interview standards. But there was just so much more that I think should be brought to the practitioners. So there was this big gap between academia. There was academics that are doing great research and publishing it amongst academics, and it is academics that read that research because you need to subscribe to a specific publisher or to a particular journal. But the information that is in those findings actually needs to get to the police practitioner who's doing the interviews, who's doing the investigations, who is trying to prevent crime. And there was a big gap between those. And I made the deliberate decision to do my PhD part-time whilst I was working full-time, which is always more difficult because of the added workload, because I wanted to sort of stand in that gap and I wanted to be a bridge. And then pretty quickly after I completed my PhD, I'm someone who always needs to have a big project to work on. I said, okay, I'm going to make videos that, everyone can watch videos. Police officers cannot watch videos on their phone, on their police computer, in a night shift, in a break, even when they're at home, if they find them interesting enough. And they can watch a video about interviewing witnesses, interviewing suspects, doing geographic profiling, linking the right crimes together, offender profiling, you name it. They can watch that, but they can't troll through all these articles that I troll through for them to put that information together. So that's how Police Science Doctor was born, really.
That is fantastic. Just as you were talking, I'm thinking, man, I wish somebody could go through all these scientific journals for me and just kind of lay it out in terms that I'm an old military guy, and so anything that's boiled down to the basics, I'm all about it. I understand you were in the middle of it, and then but I guess my question is, what inspired you to actually go on to do PhD work? I mean, that's high level stuff, and usually that requires a full time. I mean, doing that while you are also working full time, that's a full load.
I think question from doing masters. Now there was a gap between me. I've got my degree in psychology. I did a master's in interactive multimedia first, which wasn't really great. I didn't find a job with that. It was too generic. I didn't quite know what to do. So for a few years, because I had originally come to London from Germany, which is where my accent is from, to be a musician. And, I thought I was going to make it on the music scene. So I didn't even want a proper full-time job because it was going to hinder my creative development. None of that really happened. And at some point, I was just really fed up with not having that direction and not having the recognition for things I could do. And so I decided to go back to university, and plan B was psychology. I was interested in that. I was interested in forensic psychology. Then I heard about investigative psychology, which is more in the early stages. So forensic psychology is much more working with offenders after the criminal process, the investigative process and the court process have been completed. But you've got investigative psychology, which actually assists police in finding the offender in the first place and then getting the best information out of them. So I was really interested in that. And I did really enjoy my master's. I did my dissertation on geographic profiling, actually working directly with the 4 experts at the time in the country. The PhD was just a natural progression because there was so much more that I wanted to learn. There was more people, more of the experts that I wanted to interview for my study. And but I also did want to have that practical experience of working in the police. So I went and found a job in policing, and then found another job in policing, and then stayed within that force and continued my studies on the side, which wasn't always easy, but it did allow me to get access and use some of the police officers there as participants in my research as well. And I work now full-time for a small company called the Cambridge Centre for Evidence-Based Policing, which provides training and research consultancy to police forces. So I'm still in the area of research and policing, but I've got my full-time job, and now I've got my own website that I run in my own time.
So give me an example of one of the videos that you would create.
So the very first ones I created was a series of 7 videos of explaining what investigative psychology is. So it was what is offender profiling, geographic profiling, investigative interviewing, interrogation, witness interviewing, avoiding false confessions, and evidence-based policing came into that, and it expanded. I now do quite a lot of interviews with experts who have, like you and I are doing here, but just the other way around, who have something amazing to teach that I've been teaching, in a smaller circle at the university or at the conferences, and now do these interviews with those people. And the other, so that is all free content. There's, I think, 28, 29 videos in the video gallery, and that's all freely available for anyone. And if you subscribe to the email list, you get access to the read page. You can actually download all the transcripts for the videos. You've got key learning points, timestamps, and references in there. And I've got 2 new ventures now, which is one is a conference that I'm organizing, is the Rapid Fire Conference on Behavioral Science in Policing. I called it Rapid Fire because rather than you sitting through a conference talk for an hour and then you come to the conclusion, well, actually, I didn't get anything from that. I'm having 9 speakers, really high caliber speakers, and they're delivering 10-minute training sessions on their topic. I don't think that's long enough for anyone to get bored, really, who's interested enough in signing up for the conference. It's a free conference. So, I'd be very happy for any of your listeners or viewers to register if they're interested. And the other thing I'm doing is I'm developing the Police Science Doctor Academy. So I'm working with a number of subject matter experts, some of whom are actually speakers at the conference, to take the learning that they've been delivering in person and creating an online course from it, because they can reach a lot more people. And it's not only because of COVID, it's just, for the longevity of what they're teaching and the reach, because I'm working with someone in Australia, Dr. Patrick Titmarsh, who's got a way of investigating sexual offences that gets you so much more evidence than the traditional way. And, why should that only be restricted to the, 12, 15 police officers who are sitting in a classroom with him at a time, when we all need to know about that. So it's just this greater reach that you can have with online learning.
It's really amazing nowadays how much information we have access to. Here I'm sitting in the US, you're in the UK, you're from Germany, you're working with somebody from Australia, and yet we're all talking about basically the same thing. Actually, I think this is brilliant. Your thought of taking the complex, making it simple, and then making it accessible. I know police officers and detectives and crime scene investigators that spend hours and hours researching on how to perfect their trade, how to perfect their craft. And as you're explaining it, I think this is going to be a fantastic resource for them. So yeah, thanks for doing what you're doing. This is amazing.
Thank you. Any people that who are desperate for more learning, send them my way, because if they can make use of what I make available, that's great. I'm always happy to be able to help. And I get contacted by quite a lot of people on LinkedIn and via other means, and I'm always happy to help.
Oh, absolutely. So give me an example. Let's take interrogations. Mm-hmm. So what is a couple of tidbits that you would recommend due to your research that, for example, in interrogations that many detectives, for example, may not understand or may not know?
So here we've got a bit of a cultural difference between where you are and where I am, because what is quite common in America is the read technique, which is quite successful in getting confessions. And the problem is that when you're interviewing a suspect, you should never go in with a mindset or with a hope of getting a confession, because you can get a confession. You can get a confession in many ways, and more so when you use the read technique. But what's the point when the wrong person is confessing to the crime? Because you can, with witnesses and with suspects, you can interview them in such a way that what they're telling you is not what actually happened. And in the UK, and now increasingly in other countries as well, it's actually illegal to use some of the techniques that the read technique, for example, teaches. So we're not allowed to use any kind of oppression or repeat the same question too often. We're not allowed to deceive in any way. So I know that in the read technique, you're allowed to make the suspect believe that you have more evidence than you do. And this is not something that we are legally allowed to do here. And actually, a lot more success in true confessions but opening up and getting information from the suspect is achieved if you actually build up rapport with the suspect. So if you create an environment where it is safe for them to reveal information that could potentially be harmful to them. So that should really be the objective of an interview or interrogation, is that you create an atmosphere where the guilty person feels safe enough and feels they have good reasons to tell you what really happened, and where the person who's not guilty is able to give you the information that will help you advance the investigation, because you can eliminate them, but you can get information from them that can maybe give you some hints of where to look for the actual person. So building rapport in interviews and maintaining that, being genuine, being a good listener, and being on the same level. And that is difficult, and that can be challenging, because if you're sitting opposite someone who's accused of raping a child, and you're as the interviewer, you are supposed to be free of judgment, be free of any kind of understanding or communication of I'm better than you, I've got the moral high ground. You shouldn't do that in an interview. And I know that's difficult, because I had done my MSc. I was really interested in investigation of suspects. Then I went into a role in the police where I investigated suspects and I interviewed them. And they were not, high-level suspects. They were relatively low-level volume crime suspects. But I did feel that ego necessity to, it made me feel good if I got a confession. I was thinking, God, that happens to me. I should know better. So it is a very natural thing. And I'm very understanding that it does happen. But if you want the best result, it's not about you, it's about the investigation and doing justice to the victim. You're not doing justice to the victim if you lock up the wrong person. You're harming them because the real perpetrator is still out there. So there's a lot of research in terms of suspect interviews, and there's a big difference across the world as well, because in some countries the police are legally justified to beat the hell out of someone to get a confession, and they do.
So if I could play devil's advocate here for a minute, two things that I wanted to throw out at you and get your opinion on this. So first of all, I'm not sure if you've ever heard of it's Angie Dodge is the victim's name. And the guy that was put in prison for that murder as a man named Chris Tapp. And I've actually gotten to know Chris, and I know, so I've interviewed him here on All Things Crime. And it's a fascinating story because he was just a teenager, 18. Angie was just fresh out of high school. So she was 18 as well, and was stabbed like 16 times and raped and murdered, and a brutal murder in a small town in Idaho. As you can imagine, the psychology of a murder in a smaller town is much worse than in a large town where a large city where it happens fairly often. And so I think that added pressure onto the detectives, but hindsight being 2020, and FBI profilers and everybody went through those interrogation tapes, and they did exactly what you were describing, where they obviously put a lot of pressure onto Chris Tapp, and eventually, especially because he was just a teenager, and some teenagers you would think are sophisticated enough that they could understand what's going on, but clearly he wasn't. And so they eventually got a confession out of him, but it was all leading questions and just a horrible interview technique. So I think that is a perfect case to describe what you're actually showing, or what we just talked about with the interrogation techniques that aren't allowed in your country, for example. So if you ever have a few minutes, you got to look up Chris Tapp. At the same time, so that's one scenario, is you have the naive interviewee that really doesn't understand that in the interrogation process, he may be actually being led toward that. And I don't think those kind of interrogation techniques are very common anymore. I think those were more the 80s and 90s. I think they're much more sophisticated in their questioning, the line of questioning that detectives use nowadays. But at the same time, it does happen. That's one technique, or one kind of side of the scenario that I'm trying to frame here. The second part is you have an interviewee who is extremely sophisticated. He is, and I'll use the word he, but it could be a she, I guess. Very knowledgeable, very skilled at lying, very skilled at deflecting, very skilled at moving, even almost interrogating the interrogators. So what would you do based on those two types of scenarios? How would you differentiate between those? And if you have the latter case, what would you recommend detectives or the interrogators do to actually get useful information from somebody that is extremely sophisticated and skilled at lying, for example?
I think the first question is, how do you differentiate? From what you described, that would probably be pretty easy to tell even by the interviewers at the time. With the second, the sophisticated interviewee, I think it would be good, and depending on the the level of investigation that is being done, if somebody else was monitoring the interview who was not in the interview room, because when you're in an interview, there's a lot of different things you need to keep in mind, and it's very easy to forget something, which is why planning is so important. But also, if somebody is monitoring and is realizing what's going on, with the benefit of the distance, they don't have to think of the next question. They don't need to think, they don't need to make sure they formulate the question right so the solicitor doesn't intervene. If they notice that something like that is going on, you can maybe let the interview run its course, then pull the detective out and say, look, this is what he's doing. He was avoiding this, that, and that. So let's gently bring the person back to these points. So you need to, it can be very interesting to let it run, and then make notes, not mental notes, but written notes for the other person who's monitoring, what is it that he's happy to talk about? What is it he's not happy to talk about? Where is he trying to lead us away from? And we need to go back there and then think about, how do we go back there? So what is the picture they're trying to paint? What are they trying to fill in? And what are they leaving blank? Because we don't know, okay, this is what we need to get back to. And how do we get back to that? Because do we want to do it in a subtle way, or do we want to say, look, you didn't quite answer the question here. Can we just go back to the night of, Friday the 13th? And, can we just talk about that a little bit more? So I think you can't often assess the interviewee style before an interview, although sometimes you can. If you're having someone in custody, you're going to interview them, and you've got time. It's a big enough case where they give you the time to maybe review previous interview tapes, and okay, this is what he does. This is the kind of thing he does. Then you need to come up with a good strategy. And I'm sure you can do that in the US as well, even though you've got 18,000 different law enforcement agencies. But here in the UK, you can get the assistance of a specialist to help you in interview planning if you have the time for that. But even if you can't, skilled interviewers can come up with some kind of strategy by themselves. So it depends on, you need to recognize what the person is doing and why, and then find out, okay, what is it they don't want to talk about? And then, how do we get that information out of them in the best way possible?
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you brought up, that in the US, there's, with 18,000 different law enforcement agencies that range all the way from, the smaller sheriff's department that might have 6 deputies, all the way to NYPD that has 40,000 sworn officers, and everything in between that. So the amount of resources and the expertise that's going to be in the various sizes of the law enforcement agencies is going to just differ dramatically.
Yeah.
But then on top of that, and I'm not sure about other places in the world, but in the US, there is a tendency for people to promote out of positions. So for example, they might go into, like, become a detective and be assigned to the narcotics division. And then they hone their skills on the craft of catching a narcotics or a drug dealer, and go through that. And then after maybe 3 or 4 years, they promote out and they move into a different division, maybe homicide or something else. And so it's interesting that a lot of these officers that develop certain skills then promote out. Now, obviously, interrogation skills are going to go with them, but the specific areas that they might develop skills in may not translate and may not move with them. And so now they have to start over again, even using specific equipment like ours. Once we train and educate a crime scene investigator, for example, on how to use the MVAC, if they move somewhere else, now we got to start over, and we got to retrain people. And so I don't know in other places of the world if there's as much of a turnover, but in many ways in the US, in order to advance their careers, some of them have to leave for school. Some of them have to get promoted into positions that are just administrative positions, as opposed to actually being on the front lines and being a crime fighter. So it's a really interesting dynamic, especially law enforcement has to undergo here in the US. And then you add all of that onto the fact that out of those 18,000 law enforcement agencies, very few of them have any real connection. And so there's a disconnect between all of them. Not sure if you have any advice on how to educate those, but I think, especially with your resources, I think one of the challenges in reaching at least the US audience is going to be, again, because of that disconnect, how do you actually reach out and find those type of people? Because even fantastic information like what I think you are putting together, how do you educate the next person that information exists? And I think that's going to be one of the challenges, which obviously coming onto a podcast and talking about it is a great place to start. But again, that's just something to think about. But as an expert in your field, any thoughts about that disconnect?
I think one or two good organizations that we've got here is we have the College of Policing, which is a national organization, and it makes it sets standards for training for all the. So we have 43 geographical police forces in the UK, and we have just a very small number of national, for example, the British Transport Police, which cover the rail network, for example. And so the College of Policing is the one place where certain standards are set, and some of the training courses you actually have to attend the college to do that. And that is then a good resource for passing information on and feeding them into the college, and then that can then be fizzled out to everyone who needs to receive it. We also have the National Association of Chiefs of Police. I don't know if you have that with your 18,000 chiefs of police in America, if there is an organization that they all are part of. And so we then have around 43 chiefs of police, say, in the UK, and one will have responsibility for vulnerability, one will have responsibility for online investigations, and they have this national portfolio where they do some additional work and research into that field. And I think it would probably be a good idea to have some kind of standardizing organization in the US as well. And I don't want to speak too much about that as an outsider, because I don't know as much as you will about the US law enforcement system. But you're talking about the disconnect, and how do you pass information on, how do you find the right people? And that is going to be very difficult to do if you're trying to find email addresses for 18,000 different organizations. But if all the sheriffs had an organization, and then all you've got other law enforcement agency names, you've got DEA and ATF and FBI. So FBI is national. And that is something good about the FBI. They are national, they can have a certain standard, they can train everyone up to the same standard and deploy them where they need to be. And they, at least if you have the different types of law enforcement agencies having some kind of higher level common summit, people who make decisions and pass that down, then just ask each other the question, right, what works best for you here? And find out where the gaps are, where do we need to bring training in, right? I think this is a really good training course, all of our officers should be doing that. And then all of the officers that are part of this organization tree, they will receive that training, and that can make big changes. But it's not easy with the federal setup you have over there to do that. And even for police oversight, there have been cases of police officers being dismissed for misconduct and then starting to work in a different police agency somewhere else in the country, and that shouldn't be happening.
Yeah, it's a challenge for sure, and I think you will depending on how much you actually cater to the U.S. I think you'll run into a lot of the same challenges that we have over time, because as a small company trying to reach out to 18,000 different police agencies, that alone is a challenge. But then you have almost 700,000 officers throughout the US, and they are all disconnected, and very few of them talk to outside agencies. Some of them do, and some of them are excellent. But the advantage, I think, is going to be obviously, having a cell phone that you can literally access information all over the world, and it's right at your fingertips. And I don't think there's very many officers running around nowadays that don't have one of those. So yeah. I think that's a great advantage for us. So,
and something that's amazing about that is that it is one challenge to reach the 18,000 chiefs of police, but also the officers themselves. I think I have about 9,000 connections on LinkedIn, most of whom are law enforcement officers, a large proportion of that in the US. So I don't know if I'm covering, well, obviously I'm not covering all of them, but there are a lot of people who are working in law enforcement in the US who see the content that I put out and the content I publish, and obviously they have an interest in that. And the idea is hopefully they'll share it with their colleagues, and they can then also see what's there, and they can take what is in their field of interest and use it in whichever way they see most appropriate. And that is something we didn't have before. There's even 20 years ago, I don't think I would have had any option of contacting so many hundreds and thousands of police officers in the US, in Canada, in Australia, New Zealand, other countries that don't even have English as the first language. I publish everything in English, And it's just amazing that I'm able to make these connections. They're able to connect to me, and they can see what I publish, and I can ask them what else would you like me to cover. And it's just, that is something that is amazing within the modern times.
Right. Yeah. It's the ability to communicate nowadays, especially just as an individual, you can reach literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people just with the click of a button.
Mm.
And it's absolutely fantastic. It's a great equalizer. So being able to use tools and platforms like LinkedIn, which is obviously where we met, what a great way to introduce each other to this conversation. Obviously would have never happened had it not been for that platform. So that's a wonderful, yeah, I love it. I love being able to reach out and communicate with so many different people in just such an easy way. I mean, literally, you can surf through your timeline or your news feed on LinkedIn and stumble on articles and just expressions and news and all sorts of things that you would, yeah, like you said, 20 years ago, you would never be able to do that. It's
Yeah.
fantastic.
And even so, one of the persons I met on LinkedIn, her name is Ginny McKenna. She's actually going to be speaking at the conference as well. And she's developing the first course with me that I'm going to be offering on the Police Science Doctor Academy. Now, she was a frontline police officer for over 21 years in the UK. And she was met with a lot of challenges. And in the beginning, when she joined in the 80s, there was sexual discrimination and bullying going on and harassment. And she was driven to the brink of suicide and left the police, then went back into the police. And when she left the second time, she became an accredited life coach. And what she does now is absolutely amazing. So because of her journey, because of everything she's experienced, she wants to help others who are in similar situations. So she specializes in helping police officers, frontline police staff, anyone working in law enforcement as a first responder or in the back office. She helps them through stress. So she's specializing on that because one of the things she was told by clients she worked with was they had tried counseling before, but because they work in a police role and they had stories to tell that the normal person would find quite entertaining, they found that the counselor they were talking to, who was supposed to help them, was quite fascinated by that and wanted more details and wanted more stories. For them, it was almost like they were watching a reality TV show. Why did you do that? And what was that like? And she understands the job. She knows what it's about. She doesn't need to talk about that. It's actually about the person. And so it's amazing. I'm so glad I met her, because the fact that she specializes in helping people through stress. So the course is actually called Emergency Stress Pit Stop, because you need to look after yourself. You need new tires, you need to refuel to be able to go back on the road at high speed and help other people. So I'm so pleased that I met her, because she's got such important work to do. And and I know that in America you've got such a high cop suicide rate, and the amounts of stress and pressures that have been put on policing are immense. We've got them here as well, but it was just obviously so inflated in America that I know that the need for this kind of support and the need for this kind of course is really great.
Oh, absolutely. I'll tell you, there was an interview I did just a couple of episodes ago with an officer who's in the LA area named Dion Joseph, and absolutely fascinating to talk to people that are literally on the front lines. He nailed it. He basically said, every movement needs a scapegoat and kind of a villain. And right now, there's certain politicians, especially, that are mostly driving this, and they have made law enforcement the scapegoat. They've made law enforcement the villain. And it's really tragic, because it's the damage that they are doing is just astronomical, and not just to society, but also to the officers themselves. It's tragic in my opinion, just seeing what these guys are going through, the normal stresses of law enforcement anyway, because every interaction that they make is for the most part, I would think, and I'm sure you have a lot more study on this, but I would think that the majority of interactions that law enforcement has with different individuals in society is a really bad day for that person. But that's every day for law enforcement, and so that has to drag on them.
Yes, I think Ginny actually mentioned a statistic to me that the amount of highly traumatizing and extreme life events a police officer experiences just in their working life is about, it's a very big range now, but it's about 300 or 600 times the amount of that the normal person goes through. So it's immense, even without all the added stress of everything that's been going on in the media and the very one-sided representation of what was going on, especially in America. And it's interesting what you say about, the people that police encounter having a bad day. So another person I met through LinkedIn, who's also a speaker, whom I'm also working on a course on, he's got, he's done a lot of training of professionals in the past, and we're developing a course together. He was saying that police officers actually have really bad relationships because the majority of people they encounter are probably having one of the worst days of their life. And what we're developing together is a course for all officers to learn how to deal with people who are in crisis in a variety of situations, because police officer will come across someone who's run away from home, maybe a teenager, a child, somebody who's in a domestically abusive situation, but maybe doesn't want to leave. How do you respond to that? How do you help someone who's in that situation? You want to help them, but they don't want to leave, and there are reasons for that. How do you help someone who may be suicidal? How do you help someone who's just lost someone? And it's equipping police officers who that person may be referred on to a specialist further down the line, but they are literally the first responder. They may be the first person on scene. And there are so many different skills that you can amass there, and that you can put into your tool belt, so to speak. So it makes police officers very cynical and very negative sometimes. And the divorce rate among police officers is very high, because their partners who have normal jobs may not understand what they're going through. They may not understand why, right? You've just had this 12-hour shift with your mates. Why do you now need to go to the pub when pub was open and hang out with them? But actually maybe they need to debrief, and it's very complicated, and it's not an easy life. And I don't think that police officers are supported nearly enough in terms of dealing with things as they should.
I 100% agree with that. It is amazing to me, as I'm an outsider. I'm a vendor to police agencies. And so, but in the process of talking to these guys and really, in my job, obviously, is to drill down what it is they need in order to help their investigative process. And that's really why I started this video and podcast, is because I'm in the process of going through different interviews with experts like you, but even detectives and crime scene investigators, in trying to drill down what they need. A lot of the times those types of stressors come out. It's amazing how many times I've actually ended up talking to a nurse, for example, that specializes in PTSD. And I've realized that I can offer this service, and by introducing the law enforcement community to experts like you, which is again another reason to have folks like you on this show. What an advantage it is I know thousands of police officers and agencies, and I have all these connections. So in many ways, I'm kind of doing the same thing you're doing, just with different information. But again, the network, who you know, and how you portray what you know, is in many ways how you serve the very community that you're trying to serve. But the back to the original point is the level of PTSD and the level of stress and the level of interaction, the intensity of it, I think that law enforcement agencies go through. And I've never heard that stat before, but it totally makes sense, that 300 to 600% higher than what a normal person goes through. And I just know, at least from my military background, that the level of stress that military people go through compared to normal life, it's insanely different. And so I can imagine the level that these police officers go, because even when they pull somebody over to give them a ticket, that's a bad day. I've never pulled over and with those blue and red lights flashing behind me and thought, oh yeah, this is going to be fun. But I've never, on the same sense, whenever that has happened, I've never actually put myself in the officer's shoes, that they don't know who they're pulling over. They don't know what kind of day I've had. They don't know if I have a weapon in there. They don't know if I'm suicidal. They don't know, they don't have any idea who I am. But at the same time, they have to take all that into consideration. And so the level of stress that that officer has to experience just by approaching a vehicle that they're pulling over for a traffic citation, it's amazing that anybody can actually do that job.
Yes, and I think another big difference between the US and the UK law enforcement system is that here in the UK, police officers are not armed. We have specialist officers in armed response vehicles who are called out when there is a specific incident that we believe they are needed for. But in general, officers will have a baton. I don't know if you call it a button or
Right.
baton.
A baton.
Baton, and they have CS spray, handcuffs, gloves, a torch, and that will be it. But the problem is, it would be difficult, very impossible to say now to American law enforcement, well, we need to de-escalate the whole being armed thing, so we're going to start with police. You have to stop wearing weapons because it's just happening too frequently that people kill each other. You can't do that when the population is armed. And here in the UK, it's very, I don't know anyone who has a weapon, maybe some farmer who goes shooting for pheasants, or, there are fox hunters. And although I think fox hunting is done with dogs, but it's not in the culture here to have a weapon. In America, it's seen as part of freedom. We don't really understand that association, because to me, a weapon is dangerous. It's soldiers who have it, armed officers, and criminals. Those three groups mainly, hunters maybe. So it's a very different concept. So the fact that, and I think a lot of police officers have been killed when they were pulling over a car, because the person, somehow it escalated, the person had a weapon for some reason and shot the police officer. So it's very risky for them. And for me, it's mind-boggling to think that, if I was an officer in America, that every interaction could be with someone who's armed. It doesn't fit into my psyche, because it's so unnatural to me, because, we just grow up in different ways.
Yeah, it's certainly a major culture shift. And every time I go to another country, it's a mindset that you almost have to consciously get into. I think one of the three categories that you mentioned there were people that would have weapons would be criminals. And I think the number one thing that, as you were describing what a UK officer carries versus what a US officer would, the fact that they are unarmed, their biggest weapon might be a baton with a CS gas. And yet the criminal, who doesn't care about any kind of laws, the criminal may actually have a weapon. And so to me, that just puts them at such a major disadvantage. I can't fathom walking up to a car and really having no offensive weapon. CS gas and a baton are going to be defensive weapons. Yeah, you could use them to maybe fight off an aggressor, but if somebody has a weapon in their car and they're some kind of, I also understand it. There's a caveat to what I'm saying here, that just like in the US, I think the amount of actual violent weapon related, gun related crimes are going to be extremely low. And I'm sure in the UK, it's only the most hardened criminals that are actually going to pull a gun out and shoot an officer. And ironically, it's the exact same in the US. Even though out of the 330 million of us, I know the last stat I saw, there were, let's see, I know there's over 1 trillion rounds of ammunition out there and hundreds of millions of guns. But that's just, like you said, that's just part of the US culture. But the amount of interactions, the percentage of interaction, this would be really interesting if you could maybe find this in your research, what the actual percentage of violent interactions are versus the normal, you get pulled over and you get a citation for a traffic citation. So but I would bet that those two interactions are, the percentages are actually very similar.
I don't have those stats with me,
Mm-hmm.
but what I do know is, and I forgot that more and more police officers now have tasers. Do you call them tasers as well? The electronic ones with the wires that give a shock, and also body-worn video. So it's not a weapon in any sense or form, but it's an evidence gathering tool. So actually, I made a video which is called "Why Do Police Use Force?" and I was pulling bits of information from some research articles, and one of them was that the interaction between a member of the public that a police officer has reason to interact with and the police officer is much more likely to be elevated in violence if the police officer is carrying a visible weapon, even if it is a taser. So the fact that the member of the public can see that the police officer is armed with something that could, in theory, be used against them, whatever the situation was at the outset, that heightens the risk of an altercation and of the outcome is more likely to be violent than if there was no visible weapon. Now, in America, where all weapons are visible, you can see it in the officer's holster. There's no comparison because no officer will not have a weapon. So, it's quite likely that the risk is always elevated in those cases. And I don't have those statistics to compare, the percentage of violent versus non-violent interactions between the two countries. But I think possibly because of that, I wouldn't be surprised if we had fewer violent outcomes here. I don't think it's in an officer's mental repertoire to think, okay, I'm going to stop a car. They may have a weapon on them, unless, if they're stopping a car, they're doing a check first on the number plate. Somebody, in the office will check the police national computer. And if there's warning markers for weapons, then yes, they might actually wait maybe until a unit comes for backup, or they might approach differently. But they wouldn't, just have a reason to assume that there might be a weapon in the car because, like I said, they're a lot more rare in the UK.
Yeah, just absolutely fascinating. And I would love to hear that kind of research and findings if there's any way to research that down. Way out of my league here as far as running those numbers down, but I would think just because of the actual population and the number of total interactions that the police have here in the US. I don't know, you could be correct that the assumption that the police officer is going to be armed, if that escalates it, I'd never thought about that. That's very, very interesting. To me, as an American, and knowing that every time I get pulled over, that police officer is going to be armed, in my mind, and again, this is in a different mindset because I've grown up in this environment and this culture versus where you are. In my mind, I'm like, there's no way I'm going to do anything because I know the guy is armed. So I don't know, maybe there's some kind of a psychological study that you can go into there as well.
I think the reason why you decide not to basically not mess around with the officer is because you decide on a daily basis that you're going to abide by the law. Someone else who may not be deciding to abide by the law, who knows that the officer has stopped them, is going to come in and is going to put their head through the window and speak to them and is armed. They may make very different decisions because they may have something in the car that they don't want to be seen. They may be up to something they don't want the officer to know, and they may have some weapon in the car. So because the balance of power and the risk of some escalation is very high with an officer who's armed, who's just stopped someone who's also armed but shouldn't be, that can have very different outcomes. So if I was going to be stopped in America, especially in America, I wouldn't mess around anywhere with the cop, but especially in America, I think you're not even allowed to leave the car because it's seen as a sign of aggression. So I would definitely be hands off the wheel and yes, officer, and here are my papers. Yeah, you don't mess around, but that's you and me, we abide by the law. People who have very different decision-making processes and who've been making very bad decisions for many years, they would see, cop is coming, I need to get out of the situation. And maybe they make a very bad decision because they know the officer is armed, and maybe they do make a preemptive action that may be violent because of that, because it's not so easy to get away from them.
Wow, I'm just absolutely fascinated by this conversation. So as you were speaking, my thought is, so what really is the difference between, for example, a UK criminal and a US criminal, and one that they don't really care about the law anyway. They're making bad decisions. They've already decided that they're going to break laws one way or another. What is going to be the primary mindset and psychological difference between those two individuals based on their the fact that they're their geographical differences and cultural differences, in my mind, don't make as much of a difference because they've already decided to break the law. So if a criminal in the UK has already broken enough laws that they would be put in jail, for example, it's not just a minor offense, it's a major offense. What would stop that person from obtaining a weapon and defending themselves and just going on, some kind of they've already made up their mind they're not going to jail. And lots of that happens regardless of where they're at. So yeah, what would be the difference there?
So I guess if you, like you say, if we have a UK criminal, we have a US criminal, the US criminal, for them, the standard of being armed is to carry a firearm. For a UK criminal, the standard to be armed is a knife, perhaps. It's not as easy to get a weapon here. I know in the US you can buy them in Walmart or supermarkets, and I guess, and maybe other, or ammunition you can buy there. I don't know where to get them. Well, actually, I have seen a gun shop somewhere in town. I don't know if that's still open. So it is a lot more difficult to get a firearm. And I think once you've got one, the likelihood that you are going to severely hurt someone or get hurt is a lot higher, because you can hurt someone over a distance. Whereas here, for example, young people who are in gangs, they carry weapons because it makes them feel safer. Where actually they're a lot more risk of being injured by a knife if they carry a knife, statistically. But in the US, the equivalent would be not a knife, but a firearm. And if you have a firearm, are you going to pull your knife, or are you going to pull your gun if you're in an altercation? You're probably going to pull your gun because it's more threatening to others. So I think we're operating from a different standard, where the standard of what is normal violence, normal weapon carrying is already higher and much more lethal in the US.
The one thing that I would disagree with you on that, and it's probably just a media-driven misinformation, honestly, is that of all the gunshots, like Walmart, for example, if you walk into a Walmart and I try to purchase a gun, even though I have a clean record, I've never been indicted for anything, I can't walk out of that Walmart with a weapon. There's a full background check. There's all sorts of paperwork that has to be filled out. And then there's a waiting period, because your ability to actually purchase a weapon and ammunition and walk out of a store and be able to be armed all of a sudden, just absolutely misinformation. So I would say 99%, or a very, very high percentage of all the guns that are out there that are being carried by criminals were obtained illegally. They were obtained on the street. Now, yes, there are millions and millions of guns that are just floating around, especially in the US. And that again, that's just part of the culture. But if a criminal, especially somebody that's been like served jail time, is especially a felon, they're not allowed to have guns. And yet a lot of them, they will just go and obtain a weapon illegally. And so they'll always have one. And those are the types of people that are also much more likely to use it, I think. And again, I'm not speaking from experience here, just kind of from my being immersed in this atmosphere really for the last, well, in my entire life in the culture, but again, just with interacting with law enforcement in the last 10 years or so. And my understanding of weapons from my military background is fairly extensive. That being said, I don't have near the training that you do of understanding the psychological differences and those kind of things. So that's why I'm sitting here interrogating you really with all these crazy questions. But I just find it absolutely fascinating. One, that the psychological understanding of different types of criminals, but two, really talking to people like when I travel to Thailand, for example, and I talk with some of my colleagues there, they kind of have that same understanding. It's almost like they envision the US as kind of the wild, wild west, where everybody has a 6-shooter strapped to their hip, and the OK Corral happens periodically. So it's a much different reality, and the perception of reality are often very different.
Yeah, and I guess I was probably picturing Terminator 1, where Arnold Schwarzenegger walks into a shop and just, the guy hands them over for him to take, and then yes, he just takes everything and kills the guy. But yes, obviously much of the world's perception will be based on media, because that's how you find out about other places, and there will be stereotypes, and some of them may be wrong. And clearly I was wrong with how easy it is to actually get a weapon in the US.
Yeah, well, I didn't mean to be offensive in any way, but
No.
that yeah, it's so funny you bring up the Terminator. That's yeah, because I remember the guy's like, oh man, we're
I
gonna
can close up.
close early today because
Yes.
I'm gonna be selling thousands of dollars worth of equipment here and or worth of weapons, and all of a sudden, yeah, it gets turned on him. That scenario is 100% Hollywood. Because
Good to know. Good to know.
yeah, it is, and thank goodness, because you would have maniacs like the Terminator walking around and saying, "Yeah, give me that auto loader right there," and then all of a sudden he grabs a shell and puts it in there and and shoots the store owner. Yeah, no, that does not happen, and if it does, it's well, yeah, that scenario right there doesn't happen.
Good. I'm glad to hear it.
Me too, because otherwise I'd be scared to walk into a gun shop. Anyway, hey, we definitely need to talk again, because I think we could spend an hour just on every episode, every little video that you've made, because as much of a layman as I am, the psychological understanding of different interrogation techniques all the way through, I am definitely going to go check out your website and look at some of those videos, because just in our short conversation here, you have really piqued my interest. And so I definitely hope all of my listeners go and visit your website and download your videos and really share those, because I'm also thinking, as a parent, I may bone up on some of those interrogation techniques for my kids.
I hope they don't hold me responsible for that.
Yeah. Everybody knows that crisis plus time equals humor. So is there anything that's really kind of humorous that you would like to share with the audience?
Well, can I give you something that I found interesting psychologically, that I found useful? And it's very disappointing and boring now. I apologize, but I don't know if I can come up with something funny on the spot.
No, that's absolutely fine. Yeah, please do.
So something that I found really useful was that whilst I was doing my master's, my university supervisor, Professor Lawrence Allison, showed us a video and of some training they were doing for police interrogations. And actually, he's one of the great names when it comes to advocating for rapport and suspect interviews. And the training scenario he was taking us through was that I think I was actually visiting when he was actually training police officers on a suspect interviewing course, and they had actors come in to play the interviewee, and they were briefed to be in a really upset state, and just really raring and being really upset, coming into the interview room already shouting and swearing and being really confrontational because they had been arrested in front of their children. And the learning I took away from that was that if you've got someone who's like at the start of the interview, what you shouldn't do is then pull rank. And what I was talking earlier about the level of authority, and that's the wrong thing, because the guy is already in a very offensive, upset state. So what you should do is level with him, understand why he's upset, really listen and say, look, you're clearly upset about this. This something clearly didn't go well for you today. We'll talk about that, and I'll listen to that. And then we'll go and get started with the interview. Is that okay? So you make this deal with him that you're really going to listen. And then you let them speak, you let them vent, and you listen to what they say. And then if you can, you apologize not for what happened, because you can't, it's, the officers, your colleagues made the decision to arrest where and when they chose to arrest. There may have been reasons for that, but you can apologize for the upset that has caused. And then the person feels heard, they feel understood, and then you can get on with the interview because they agreed to do so. So they feel psychologically obliged to do that. And I had that exact same scenario in one of the interviews that I was doing. So it was for a domestic abuse case. And so the guy was brought into the interview room, or I picked him up from the custody desk, and he was in a really upset state about something. And I did exactly that. I said, okay, I can see you're upset. We'll have a chat about that, but then is it okay if after that we then start with the interview? And he agreed to that. I listened to him. I made him feel heard. I gave him empathy and everything. And then he had that off his chest, and he had said his piece, and then we went on with the interview, and the interview was actually really cooperative and was really positive in a sense. And I guess he came out of the interview feeling much better than he did when he came in. And even though I went into a hostile situation initially, it was completely the hostility was completely deflated. So I thought that was a really interesting insight, but it's not very funny, I'm sorry. It's just
No,
useful information for anyone who's
yeah.
watching who's in a similar situation like that.
Oh, the fact that it's not humorous it actually gives it more weight. So,
and maybe try it with your kids. If they're really upset, rather than shouting back for them to be quiet, just say, I can see something's bothering you. I'm going to listen to you, and then we'll talk about mowing the lawn like you were supposed to. Give that a try and see how it works.
I certainly at times need to employ some of the techniques that I learn from experts like you, because there are times that my kids walk all over me, and there's other times that I know I do not help the situation based on my temper. So yes, we'll study some of your interrogation techniques and feedback. So I appreciate it. Is there anything, first of all, we definitely need to share your website.
Yes, please. Is www.policesciencedr.com. So policesciencedoctor.com. If you Google police science doctor, it will come up straight away.
Fantastic. And your podcast?
It's also the Police Science Doctor podcast.
Very good. Okay. Well, Susanne, I appreciate you coming on.
Thank you very much, Jared.
All right. Well, I will definitely post links to both your podcast and your website. And I hope all of our listeners go and visit it and download some of that information, even if they're not law enforcement, because clearly, as a parent, as a person that interacts with coworkers and even people in Walmart, who knows what kind of interactions would benefit if I had
Arnold
have a little bit.
Schwarzenegger might walk in.
Right. Yeah. You never know when Arnold Schwarzenegger is going to walk in and demand an autoloader. So
exactly.
Let's just hope that never happens.
Okay. Good luck. Thank you very much, Jared.
Oh, my pleasure. Okay. We'll talk to you later.
Okay. Bye.